It occurs to me as you're both talking that both of you have faced serious illness in your lives, and I'm wondering if that at all has shaped your view of the afterlife. Christopher?
I would say it fractionally increases my contempt for the false consolation element of religion and my dislike for the dictatorial and totalitarian part of it. But I presume what I say by the first is self-evident. But what I mean by the second is it's considered perfectly normal in this society to approach dying people who you don't know, but who are unbelievers, and say, now are you going to change your mind? It's, in fact, it's considered almost a polite question. And as you know, there's a long history of fraud about this. People claim that Darwin had a deathbed recantation. They made up lies about Thomas Paine. It goes on all the time. It's a very nasty little history, but there's also a horrible undertone of blackmail to it. People write and say, look, you've got about one chance left now. Aren't you going to take it? I'm writing to you as a friend. They've even tried it on me when I've been very ill and I haven't had quite the vinegar I'd like to have had in a hospital bed. I don't mind, I can take it. But I think there are a lot of people older than myself, iller than myself, perhaps at the risk of seeming conceited, less educated than myself, to whom that's a horrible experience. It's very depressing and alarming to be spoken to in that way. I mean, if Sam and I were to form a core of people to go around religious hospitals, which is what happens in reverse, and say to people who are lying in pain, say, did you say you were Catholic? Yes. Well, look, you may only have a few days left, but you don't have to live them as a serf, you know. Just recognize that was all bullshit, that the priests have been cheating you. And I guarantee you'll feel better. I don't think that would be very ethical.
Okay, but
I think it would be something of a breach of taste. But if it's in the name of if it's in the name of God, it has a social license. Well, fuck that, is what I say. And will say, if it's my last breath. Thank you.
Last one. This one came from the chat room. When I'm in the hospital witnessing, should I refrain when the nurses ask me to stop handing out tracts? Have you done any evangelism in hospitals?
I guess, yes, I have, yeah. Yeah, you've got to use wisdom. You've got to be subtle. If it's a private hospital, you've got to do what they say. Mm-hmm. Even in a public hospital, you've got to be very careful, I presume. Their job is the welfare of the patients, and they really don't want you hassling them. I think it's good to bear in mind that people, if they don't know who you are, they don't know if you're a wacko, if you're from that crazy Baptist church that says hates fags and all that stuff. They don't know if you're like that. So I can understand why they feel like that. If they don't know who you are and what you're giving out, they can say, please refrain from doing that, because this is an institution where people are sick. So just use a lot of wisdom. Yeah, you certainly don't want the folks from Westboro Baptist. That's what I was trying to say. Yes, yeah, right. I couldn't remember the exact name. Yeah. You know, something else important to note, by law, at least here in the United States, a hospital room is considered a person's residence. Oh, that's interesting. So you can't just arbitrarily go into someone's hospital room unless you're invited to come in, much the same way, you know, the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon missionaries or the Christians going door to door can't just open up someone's door and walk into their living room and start sharing the gospel. Take those tubes out, I want to talk to you, basically. No, you just, that's not. But if you're invited in, well, then you can share the gospel until they tell you to leave, kind of like a situation Chad had.
Yeah, I think that you're bringing up something we talked about in the office a little bit earlier. That's right. About how I broke the law, technically speaking, in some form or another. No, I don't think you broke the law because he asked you to come in. Okay. Yes, and then he asked me to leave. Do you have to leave someone's home when they want you to leave? Yeah, otherwise it's trespassing. That's because you were standing on his oxygen hose. Oh, okay. Well, go ahead. Yeah. I was visiting a friend's father of mine who had been taking a lot of steroids, and he was at the hospital because he had had a seizure at home. So while we were visiting him, the nurse had to be with my friend's father. So I began to stroll around the hospital. So I was a brand new believer and very zealous. I just, had to share with everybody everywhere I went, and I really should still be that way. That's how Ray is. He's uncontrollable in that sense. But But I saw this old man, as I was walking by, the old man called me into the office, or into his room. He said, "Hey, you, kind of come on over here." And he wanted me to help him, sit him up and get him a drink of water. So I did that, and looking at this fella, I mean, he was closer to 100 years old than anything else. He didn't have very much more time to live, whether he got out of the hospital or not. So I wanted to share with this fella, you're gonna die, sometime soon. You're gonna face God. Do you know where you're gonna go when you die? And as soon as I said that, the guy just was livid. He was freaking out, screaming on the top of his lungs, "Get out of my room! Get out of my room!" I felt, I can't leave it this way. So I just kind of powered through the law and the gospel with the guy. But yeah, he was screaming for me to get out of the room, and I hung in there to the end and got the gospel out.
Ray, I had
Well, he wasn't standing on his oxygen hose, was he?
No.
That's good.
He wouldn't have been screaming. He'd be gasping for air. I had an interesting opportunity at a local hospital, which will remain nameless for the moment anyways, but a friend of mine, he and his wife, they had their baby there, and as they're in the hospital room,
I had to go into hospital for surgery, just an overnight stay. After the surgery, I went into a ward. There were 3 blokes, all older than me, in that ward. The first one was a middle-class, working kind of a fella. Liked sports, fishing. Worked with his hands all his life. He had ass cancer. I didn't inquire. He was losing his hair from chemo, and he'd been in hospital for a long time. I could tell because he had a routine. He had all the equipment, toothbrushes in little tiny plastic containers, cups in little containers. His name was Jono. Nice bloke. Kinda laconically humorous. There was another older fella in the ward, Antonino. Italian fella, I think. His family had come and visit him regularly. They'd all sit around and chat in chairs. He'd be wearing his pajamas. During the nights, Antonino would cough all night. Phlegmy coughs. He wore an oxygen mask. Also in the ward was another guy, again older than me, 60s maybe less. His name was Alex, and he'd been in hospital, nursing homes for 12 years. He'd mumble to himself, talk to himself. He called all the nurses sexy. "Hello, sexy," he'd say, in a rather chipper frame of voice. The nurses would wash him, clean up his shit, feed him. And all the while he'd talk about how he was going to manage the world's largest port. Huge ships coming and going when he got out of hospital. I was only in there overnight. And so I had to leave the next day. I said to Jono, "Good luck, mate." And I shook his hand. I asked Jono to look out for Alex, who often complained that he was hungry, wanted some food. "Keep an eye out for Alex," I said. I then looked to Antonino. I hadn't really talked with Antonino, but I caught his eye, and he looked back, and I blinked, and I nodded, and he looked back to me, and he blinked, and he nodded. And I left.
He didn't have very much more time to live, whether he got out of the hospital or not. So I wanted to share with this fella, you know, you're gonna die, you know, sometime soon. You're gonna face God. Do you know where you're gonna go when you die? And as soon as I said that, the guy just was livid. He was freaking out, screaming on the top of his lungs, "Get out of my room! Get out of my room!" I felt, oh, I can't leave it this way. So I just kind of powered through the law and the gospel with the guy. But yeah, he was screaming for me to get out of the room, and I hung in there to the end and got the gospel out.
You know, Ray, I had
But he wasn't standing on his oxygen hose, was he?
No.
That's good. That
he wouldn't have been screaming. He'd be gasping for air. I had an interesting opportunity at a local hospital.
Fuck you, Chad.